The Dregs, one of Conan's easiest dungeons. You've probably cleared it a few times and never came back, but what secrets does it hold out of bounds? Today, we're going to find out. When you enter the dungeon, you arrive in a gaping cave complex, partially flooded and containing deep pools of water, glowing goop and loot chests. However, the first question is, where exactly are we on the map? The Dregs is contained inside a black skybox which itself is found underground near the centre of map square D2. Being just outside the curse wall, this is probably one of the closest dungeons I've seen to the mainland map thus far. Heading back to the entrance cave, the construction is pretty typical of most cave systems. The internal structure is borrowed straight from the unnamed city, which makes sense given its lore connection, whilst the cavern pieces are your very typical one-sided rock meshes. It's worth noting here that the water itself also sits as a sort of box over the ground level. The entire world actually has a base water level underneath the map, and this is often how water is handled, simply just a box with the water texture and effect. We'll touch on the water again a bit later on, but underneath the floor there's not too much interesting going on. Pushing past the first door, we end up in a small chamber before some stairs. It's fairly unremarkable, but those lights from the vents on either side are quite interesting. On the other side of the vent there is some sort of effect point, where you can see a small reflection of the light inside. It's the same light of course, but I'm guessing it casts from an invisible point just outside the walls as it passes through what seems to be a bright layer and casts onto the floor, which will overall emulate the light shining through the vents. I've seen this in quite a few dungeons now, and it's just quite interesting to deconstruct how they handle these light effects. If we pull out a little further, the structure of the dungeon is very interesting, and as probably one of the earlier dungeons developed, I think it indicates some interesting stuff about the development process. The interior of the Dregs, even for an early game dungeon, is quite impressive and very atmospheric. However, if we pull ourselves right to the edge of that black skybox, we can remove all the atmosphere and get the proper lay of the land. The Dregs, for the most part, is a very simple dungeon. All the major texturing and design is on the interior, with the exterior side of the pieces having very basic textures, and they are constructed in very simple blocks. You can also see that all the internal Giant King architecture is mostly made of cut and stick pieces that are then dropped in at the correct angle, as opposed to being actually built into the design. You've also doubtless noticed these red boxes at the bottom of each water segment. At first I thought maybe they were collision boxes or something like that, though on closer inspection it seems the border dictates where the water effect starts on screen, which is quite an interesting tidbit to see some of the little relics and internal flags of development. We'll actually come back to these red boxes a bit later as they have a very interesting mechanic in this dungeon. Another noteworthy thing are the two main shafts of light in this dungeon. They're located in the room with the spider boss, and in the large rectangular room with the undead. Much like the lights in the vent before, these beams are entirely artificial. They're created using miniature versions of sky beams that are then cut off by the black skybox, and they fade just a bit above the ground to mimic god rays. For the light effect on the floor, I suspect there's also an invisible light node similar to the vents earlier to cast the ring of light onto the floor with the shadows of the bars above. For our last point of interest, we reach the boss tower right at the end of the dungeon. We actually get a really interesting view into the tower here, as most of the walls are invisible on the interior. I think this is where you get a really good view of the way things are put together and how prefab items are used to detail the interiors, alongside how some of these areas are structured. You can also see beneath the abysmal remnant. Without the water and smoke, the beast is fairly diminutive in stature, and alongside a better view of the bones and details inside the pool, you can also see again the red fluid box. This actually reduces itself to just below the floor level when the remnant is killed. This is the same process throughout the dungeon, where you trigger water level changes, the fluid box on the outside will raise and lower respectively to represent that adjustment. I think it's quite interesting to see how some of these things work. The Dregs is somewhat unique as it does have those water mechanics in the dungeon itself, and it also explains why there are multiple smaller red boxes as opposed to just one giant water block across the map like is done, well, in the overworld, because they're all linked to their own individual water level controllers. Additionally, due to the dungeon changes in the Age of War Chapter 2, an extra platforming section is now available above the Abysmal Remnant's boss arena. This was actually inaccessible for a long time but has now been rendered accessible and contains some loot. However, you can't actually get right to the top of the dungeon. If you could, you would find a large empty chamber with a strange structure on the ceiling. Lore-wise, the abysmal remnant was an experiment by the Giant Kings, an attempt to craft a weapon to use against the Lemurians in the war. The Priest King summoned a demon into flesh, but the experiment was born limbless, and it was thus tossed into the unnamed city's sewer system to drown. Of course that didn't happen, and the abysmal remnant has been down here since. However, that strange structure, all the way up there, I think could be interpreted as the exact place where the remnant was dumped. It's easily the tallest part of the dungeon, and I don't think it's a great leap of assumption to assume that it links to the unnamed city, and the structure atop it is quite simply some sort of plug. Whomever chose to throw the remnant down here would have lifted the plug, thrown it in, and closed it up forever, assuming the beast would die soon after. This little detail is very easy to miss, even with the new platforming section, but I think it's a nice way that ties the story of the abysmal remnant to the actual architecture of the dungeon. The Dregs is not the most impressive dungeon in terms of gameplay, at least not after the first run or two. Most seasoned players will probably overlook the Dregs as little more than something they might have to do for a couple of recipes, but I actually think it's quite interesting. Oversized sewer systems make for great dungeons, and I think that inspiration can really be seen through the construction both on the interior and exterior. A lot of the secrets of the Dregs relate to its development and generally how dungeons are put together, but for me I find it impressive how the sewer system motif is clear in parts even from the outside. I really like seeing how the water systems work when they raise and lower. It's quite interesting to get a more in-depth technical look at how water functions in general, and generally, though the Dregs is, again, not that impressive, there are some interesting tidbits of both development and potentially lore implications too, that make the Out of Bounds search quite interesting. And there we have it, the Out of Bounds secrets for the Dregs. Thanks for watching, and of course a massive thanks to our wonderful, esteemed coffee cultists for continuing to support the channel over on Patreon. You guys seem to really enjoy the Out of Bounds for Quirks lair, so I thought I'd head over to this one next. There are of course a lot of dungeons in the game, so let me know which one you want to see for Out of Bounds next. Again, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you soon.